Is rock and roll really dead? Let's talk about the independent film, The Incoherence. Welcome to the Film Threat Podcast. I am Chris Gore. I am pleased to talk to the writer-director of The Incoherence, Jared Barel. Good to have you on the Film Threat Podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. I have to make a correction, though. I did not write it.
You did not write it. Okay.
No, sorry. That credit goes to Jeff Auer, who's the star of the film also. So.
Gotcha. It's, it really is sort of this, it's sort of the flip of the rock and roll dream, right? The rock and roll dream is you're going to go, you're going to make it. You're going for your dream. You started in a garage. Now you're playing stadiums. This is about the band that never made it. This is about, and I honestly, I don't know a lot about the behind the scenes, the making of the film, which is why you're here. But it feels really authentic, the songs, because the Incoherence fictionally in your film is this band in the 90s that was just on the cusp and then kind of flamed out, right? And you hear a lot of bands about that, but you never hear the story of what happens to those bands after. So where did all this come from? How did it come together? And I have a lot of big questions about the music in the film as well, but how did it all come together?
Sure. Well, ironically, Jeff Auer, who wrote the film, is probably the only one of us who wasn't actually in a band in the 90s of our production team. But he had sort of horsed around with some friends in the 90s, and they created a little fake band that never really did anything called the Incoherence. And if nothing else, it spawned the concept for creating a screenplay about this band. Years later, after he connected with one of the other stars, Alex Emanuel, and they decided, hey, let's start making this movie. Alex, who had started a bunch of projects of mine, hit me up and said, hey, you want to help me out and direct this little short film that I'm doing with this friend of mine to help try and get this feature film off the ground. I said, sure, I'd love to do that. Rock and roll, let's shoot it in my garage. We got all the drums and the amps and stuff. And this little short film was hilarious. It came out great. We had like a $300 budget. We didn't, it was nothing. But the charisma between these actors and these characters was just undeniable. So shortly after, I hit up Jeff and I said, I'd love to read this script. And as someone who's played in bands, most of my life, there were just so many pieces of this script that hit home and spoke so much truth that I said, I called him up after I finished reading. I said, I'd like to make this movie. And all these many, many years later, here we are.
Well, it's weird because I'm never been in a band, never aspired to be. I I've done karaoke like most, but so much. I have had many friends in bands. I've even directed a couple of music videos for friends in bands in Detroit, and everything about this level of band just seems so authentic to the backstage, to the sort of cast of characters that surround, to the managers, to just like, you're renting this shitty space just to like be able to, practice together. Like all of that just really felt authentic. I mean, I think it's what made the film really work too.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you. Cause I it's one of those things I don't think, and I think this is to our credit, I don't think a lot of people really understand how small a budget we had. I mean, this is a really tiny movie. So a lot of its success, as a story, as a film, comes from the authenticity that we aspire to put into it. Again, like I said, as people who played in bands in the 90s and stuff in New York, and beyond the 90s, I had a band that I had going on till about 2006. So it's as close as I got to today. We played in a lot of these clubs. I've also come from shooting music videos, and had a nice, fortunate experience of a couple of the locations that we used in the film actually were locations that I used for music videos that I shot in the area. So there is sort of that tie-in to, real bands and making real music, and just the idea that we know when you're in certain situations, like you need this character and that character because they're part of that whole world. And we also know when it's like, no, that would never happen. So it was important to us to make sure that we got it right. if for nothing else, to just make it feel real.
I mean, it really had an authenticity that I feel like is sort of the opposite of these films that we've seen, these kind of like epic rock, documentary or rock films like Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocket Man, among others. There's the sort of meteoric rock, there's sort of that, and this is the kind of indie version, I guess, in that sense. One thing that really struck me was the music seemed so authentic to that period, where I'm like, I'm really glad there's a couple of scenes where you just let the whole song play. A lot of a lot of films, they're like, well, here's part of the song because you kind of already know the song. But since we didn't necessarily, as I didn't know all these songs, I thought it was great that you actually in certain parts, let the entire song play. What went into creating all the music for the film?
Well, first off, I mean, I'm glad that in letting certain songs play out, that's something that you enjoyed. That's always, I think, from a directing and editing standpoint, one of the biggest issues, because you look at it and you say, like, well, is this too much? Is it not enough? Do we give the audience enough? Are we, beating it down? Do we have enough time for story? Are we playing music too much? So I'm glad that balance seemed to be hopefully successful. But to credit again Alex Emanuel, who stars as Jimmy, and Jeff Auer, they busted their hump to record a lot of songs. They put together about 25 demos that I then had the privilege of being able to go through and make my selections to see what was going to make the film and what was going to tell the story the best that we could. And it was mid-production that we got these guys into the studio to start recording and get our final production recordings for the film. So, like any other indie film, it's a happy balancing act.
Well, it's interesting because even I'm surprised that there hasn't been a band. Has there been a band called the Incoherents? Because there's a great scene where they talk about like they're going through the different bands that one of the characters has been in, and those are all actually really good names for bands.
My personal favorite is Grundle Butter.
Grundle, like, what are these? But I mean, you hear names for bands. I don't know. I love that. Jello Biafra used to do a spoken word show where he would just read a list of names for bands that were just crazy. So right. I have to say, were any of those real or came out of the experiences of some of the actors?
That's a good question. If I'm not mistaken, the story goes that Jeff had written for that scene a laundry list of band names. And Alex looked at him before we were going to shoot and said, there's no way I'm going to remember all of these ridiculous names. And there's a punchline that ends with a particular band name. And Jeff said to Alex, just so long as you get to this band name at the end, go nuts. And funny enough, the edit from that scene had to have been chopped down a couple times because he rattled off so many funny band names that I'm pretty sure were at least 90% ad-libbed. It was hard to select a favorite few. And so a lot of that scene was really edited around the fact that he spatted out this band name Grundle Butter, which had me laughing behind the camera to a point I was worried I was going to ruin the take. And so the edit is based around the take where he said Grundle Butter, because I thought it was hilarious.
The other interesting thing that's explored in the film thematically is all these guys they've moved on, whatever their rock and roll dream was, it's come and gone. They just have like kind of suburban normal lives. It's almost like a superhero in the sense of like a secret identity, right? They don't want to be too revealing about that. Like, hey, I'm in this band. And they're even competing against bands that are new, newer, younger bands. How does that sort of resonate in reality in terms of, here's the sort of boring jobs that they have and they kind of have to balance that. I thought that was a really interesting aspect.
Well, I think it's interesting that, in real life, for any of us who are doing sort of creative things on top of maybe real life job things and stuff like that. I think to a certain degree, it does become this alter ego, right? Like it's something that sounds like, silliness, that, oh, I'm still doing my band in my 40s or whatever. I mean, even us spending years working on this feature film while balancing whatever else we were doing to be able to keep ourselves afloat making a movie, you know, I think at some point, it's hard. I think you hide this inner thing because you're afraid of what other people may think. I think you're afraid that it may come off as silly or foolish or some pipe dream or pie in the sky kind of thing. And I think that reflects a lot in these characters, you know, sort of maintaining their day-to-day lives and sort of keeping this as their alter ego. You know, and of course the hope is that you blow up and you find success and you can say, haha, I'm a rock star. So, you know, I guess
well, I love that aspect of it because it really felt a lot like you're commenting not just on music, but on indie film.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of meta commentary in the film. I think it's not. I think it's important for anybody who's you know, any of the viewers that while the movie's about rock and roll, that's the subject that we picked. It's really about anything. You know, whatever your passion is, whatever that sort of your alter ego is, that dream that you're hoping to pursue, you know, it can apply to anything. And so, you know, on the sense of indie filming, we talk about this all the time, that there's definite meta commentary about this. I mean, even just doing and learning how to promote a feature film, and you know, I had a temper tantrum the other day on our production call because I was just so tired of, you know, talking about Instagram likes. But that's the reality of today is, you know, you're looking at your social media and things like that, and you're always competing with someone younger than you who's got some more resources or something like that. So yeah, I think it's just a story that has a reach beyond the subject matter that we chose to tell it.
Well, it definitely universally kind of addresses, like, here's the thing you aspired to be when you were, you know, young, filled with passion and whatnot. And when do you give that up, or do you never give it up? You know, I mean, I think I mean, I see it through the lens of indie film just because that's the world that I play in. But I really think you're right. It does have a universal, definitely has a universal appeal. I want to ask also about, there's something that is touched on in the film that I thought was really amazing. There's this confrontation with this power player in the music world, right? This woman backstage, you know, they're sort of going to kiss the ring, right? For this character, which, you know, I'm sure reflects a lot of different types of people in the music industry. And the thing that she said just blew my mind. There's a, I mean, she talks about the whole thing about Instagram likes, which I also find really annoying.
Yeah.
That, like, social media is a barometer, I guess, but it's not everything. It's not everything. But she mentions that, like, rock and roll is sort of a subgenre now. I mean, where is you're a musician and a film director? Where do you see music today? Because, I mean, I grew up on rock, punk, and just sort of all the sort of incarnations, 90s grunge, all that stuff. Where is music now? Because I don't necessarily, and I don't want to, like, bag on today's music per se, but I never thought of rock as being a genre, like a subgenre that's not in favor.
Right. I don't know if it's necessarily a subgenre, but it is a genre that's sort of taken a back seat. I mean, you know, it's this is something that we've always talked about internally too, in this idea that, you know, rock and roll is hardly a thing today, which is really sad. There's a lot of music today. I think, you know, digital recording and digital releases and things like that have opened the floodgates for a lot of new artists that you might not have necessarily seen or heard. But today it does feel like rock and roll is sort of taking a back seat in the musical zeitgeist. You know, I think that it's going to come and go. I think there are different voices for rock music that has, you know, evolved and devolved over the last, you know, 50, 70 years. I do think that there are interesting subversive things happening musically. And I think really when you look at what rock and roll is, it's there. I think it's more of an attitude. I think it's more of, again, like I don't know, it's more of a feeling. It doesn't necessarily need to be defined by what we typically think of as rock and roll. I mean, especially if you dissect rock and roll as in itself, there are so many genres of rock and roll that sound so different from each other that maybe it's time to open up what that means and take a look at some of the more subversive stuff that's happening today, and have that sort of, recognize that as a reflection of what rock and roll stood for, in all the years up until today.
Well, it's interesting because when I hear, I'm not a country music fan, okay, and I'm not bagging on it, just not a fan of it. But I hear some country songs and I'm like, that's just a rock song.
Well, I mean, where do you draw the line, though, right? I mean, Johnny
Right.
Cash, right? Was he a country musician? Was he a rock musician? There is a lot of that bleed through. I mean, a musician friend of mine recently, we were talking about, not big fans of country music, but the tones and the sounds that they use today are definitely the closest thing that we're getting to rock and roll. I mean, some of the guitar solos and guitar work that they do, it again may not be my type of music, but in terms of rock and roll, hell yeah, they're still rocking out. Does it bleed into other parts of mainstream music? At varying degrees.
Well, let's talk about, you were mentioning being on a call with your production team and whatnot. You're promoting your film, which came out at a very interesting time.
It did.
Not to segue off into a conversation about that, but I actually am optimistic. I'm positive that I think that this is a time when Hollywood has had to shut down production of big, whatever it is. Your big blockbusters, they're shut down. Your big television shows, they're all shut down. And there is an entire world of indie film out there just waiting for. So when you've binge watched Tiger King for the second time, or when you've seen like all the sort of in limited release theater stuff, indie stuff is right up there for the taking. I mean, I think this is the time where indie films can really take over because it's a level playing field, right? I mean, Invisible Man came out from Universal, you can get it on VOD. You can get your film on VOD. I saw your movie I saw your movie was on Vudu, which was great. I mean, it's so the playing field is leveled. So how can independents like yourself use this as an opportunity to promote their projects? Because it's not so much about the Instagram likes. To me, it's all about getting those VOD rentals and sales. What do you do, and what can you pass on to other filmmakers who might be watching?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, we were working with our marketing team before the whole quarantine thing happened, and when it did happen, we sat there for a second and said, "Is this good? Is it bad? Is it great? Is it awful?" The truth of the matter is, we still don't know. And the film came out, 2 weeks ago now. But it is an interesting thing. I mean, to see when we did like our release, to see, the film, like, charting up and trending on all these different categories on iTunes, and being right next to, like, Daniel Radcliffe's new movie, there is sort of a level playing field in that respect. In other respects, though, you're still looking at the competition between a small budget film like ours that also has a small budget for marketing and getting the word out there, still competing with that big Hollywood studio production budget, which keeps their films trending on the top of those lists and has us being like, oh crap, let's get more milk money to throw at, Facebook ads or something like that to make sure that we're getting those rentals and that people know what it is. And that's really the big, the name of the game when it comes to putting out, whether it's a film or music or anything, is just awareness. So, as indie filmmakers, we're always fighting that battle of making sure that we have the utmost awareness of what the film is and that it's out there and that people even know it exists so that they know to maybe want to click on it. And that, I think, quarantine or not quarantine, I guess we'll see how that balances out in the coming weeks. But that seems to be an endless battle. But when we were trending or are trending or whatever it is that, and people are seeing it and clicking on it and liking it and watching it, that does seem to level the playing field a little bit. So there's an interesting dichotomy there that of yes and no, to answer your question, I guess.
Well, it's cool because Vudu is the one I usually purchase movies on.
Okay.
I just like it just because of the variety and it's simple, and then I can connect it to all my other accounts of Movies Anywhere and whatnot. But I just think it's interesting because they have even a category that's like indie films on VOD, or in theaters now on VOD. It's like that simultaneous day and date. I can actually see Hollywood doing that. I can see like the new Wonder Woman movie or Black Widow, or these films being released in theaters in limited release and drive-ins, and then I can see them charging a premium like $50 or $60. But if you consider $60 for a movie, okay, but it's also in theaters, that's about the same as 4 people going to a movie, right? $15 a ticket. So one quick thing is, I love I almost called it album art, not album art. The key art for your movie is great because it looks like an album, right? Which I think was what you were going for. It looks like kind of an album cover, but it's not. It's a movie poster and whatnot. And so one thing I would say to indie filmmakers is have really good key art for your film. So when you're scrolling, it definitely catches your eye, and also have a textless version of the key art, because people like myself can use that, in artwork, like the thumbnail for this on YouTube, or the podcast art. A textless version of that art is really important. So I hope you have a textless version of the art, because I'm going to need it.
Absolutely. When we wrap up here, it's first thing getting into your inbox.
Cool. But do you have any other final thoughts on the project? Like, this was obviously years in the making.
Yeah.
Obviously a passion project. There's a lot of heart to it. The music is authentic. The storytelling is authentic. I don't want to ruin anything about the ending, but it really feels like an authentic ending to this type of story. What are your takeaways and final thoughts?
Just in general, I'm just really proud of what we did. I think I mentioned this earlier that I know for a fact that people don't know really how limited our resources were for this film. And often when I tell people the budget and things like that, people are blown away. And it changes the perspective even on that, is like, wow, like, really? And the fact that people are seeing this tiny little film as, just another regular budget, big Hollywood production thing, is sort of the biggest compliment that I can get. At the same time, who cares? It's a good movie, and people are really enjoying it. And I'm just really proud of all the effort and the work that the team and the cast and crew and everybody put into it. It was a labor of love, but it also took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get that love to make this movie. So yeah, I mean, to see it on all these platforms and to see it released and to be able to have conversations like this about this little movie that could, it's mind blowing. So thanks for the opportunity.
Well, yeah. And thank you, Jared. It's a pleasure. The film is The Incoherence. Check it out. It's on all your VOD, video on demand platforms, so you can get it on everything. Check it out. And Jared, thank you for being on the Film Trap podcast.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Cool.